Thank you, Mr. Chairman, panelists, participants. Thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts on this issue. Looking at the animal metaphors in the title, the eagle and the elephant may aspire to fly high, but the elephant and the donkey are clearly having great difficulty coexisting in the US. And I think even as we think about strategy and strategic dimensions of the relationship, we need to keep some focus on the tactical, the immediate. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about the immediate macroeconomic situation and its potential consequences for India, and then move on to laying out perhaps some sort of shared economic interests which will in some way shape the strategic relationship. As we all know, the US government is now in a state of shutdown. There has been no agreement on the budget for fiscal 14, which started on October 1st, and effectively the government is only spending what it can under emergency provisions. This is now compounded by the prospect of a failure to agree on an expansion of or raising of the debt ceiling. The US government's capacity to borrow runs out on October 17th, and if there is no agreement, the government could go into a default. Now, this has never happened before. We've had shutdowns before, but we've not had a default. And even up to a few days ago, the prospects of this materializing were seen to be negligible. But over the last few days, somehow that risk perception has become more intense, and people are actually talking about it not being just a remote possibility, but a somewhat more likely outcome, even if it's still being seen as a situation which will be resolved before the deadline. But what we've seen over the last few months reflects the enormous significance of US domestic macroeconomic developments on the Indian economy, and not, of course, not just the Indian economy, but all emerging markets. And I think that is a situation which we've got to be quite conscious of, both in terms of the individual relationship with the US and in terms of collective framework, G20 or G20-like groupings that have to think in terms of insulating in some fashion their domestic economies from upheavals, turbulence that emerges in the US in particular, but of course throughout the Western world. And this is an experience we've been through in 2008. Some people would say we're still actually paying the price for that, but it's certainly become much more vivid in the last few months. It appears that every time a shock emerges, or a potential shock emerges in the US, there is an immediate consequence on the Indian economy. We have our own vulnerabilities, obviously. Our external exposures are high and are putting some stress on the system. So the combination of a shock emerging from the US and domestic vulnerabilities has resulted in these massive upheavals. So we've seen the rupee being the most direct shock absorber in this situation. From May, when the US Fed announced the possibility of a rollback on its liquidity measures, till the middle of September roughly, the rupee depreciated by 15% or so. And it's only when the Fed announced that it would not taper in the immediate future that the rupee has recovered somewhat. Of course, certain things were done domestically also to help that along. So this is a fragility or sort of delicacy to the linkage between the two economies that obviously shape the relationship immediately and will presumably have some bearing on the strategic aspect of it as well. But moving on to the longer term issues, I think the basic principle with which I would approach this is to look at shared interests. And whatever the rhetoric has been, whatever the allegations, counter allegations about unfair practices or restrictive practices and so on have been, the fact remains that there has been a very systematic increase in the degree of integration, and of course most of it in terms of concrete outcomes has happened through head counts. The head counts in India of US or US based firms is extremely high. I mean, I worked for a US company between 2007 and 2009, and in those 4 or 5 years, 2-3 years before that, India became the second largest base for the human resources. 30% of their global headcount was in India, 60% was in the US, and 10% was in the rest of the world. This is not a very large company. The big IT companies have, I think, even larger percentages. So there's an enormous base to the relationship, which is really going to be only marginally influenced, I think, by what is happening at a policy or a sort of diplomatic level. And that base is being driven by the most elementary considerations of business, which is where are you getting the best value for money, where are you getting the best quality for the lowest price, and as long as that equation remains, the relationship is going to continue to move. To talk about some more specific sectors, the biggest export from India to the US in 2012-13, I believe it's going down somewhat, but it is something of great significance, is guar gum. I don't even know what it looks like, but we are exporting $2 billion worth, $2.5 billion worth of guar gum to the US.
As a stabilizer in low-fat foods.
And so it is an essential input into the US drive for energy self-sufficiency, because its most important use in the US now is in the fracking process, the hydrofracturing process. There are some chemical substitutes being developed, but as of now, it still remains the major source of this particular property that it adds to the water. In the pharma side, the stalemate is based on Obamacare and the resistance of the elephant, the Republican Party, to funding it. But one presumes that somewhere along the line it will go ahead. Now, the basic premise of Obamacare is cost efficiency. This whole framework, this whole system will work only if costs are contained, and in that process, the dependence on generics is going to increase even more. More and more demand for generics is going to be the result of this, assuming that Obamacare goes forward. The biggest source of generics to the US is India, so we are seeing some friction in terms of approvals and licenses of Indian plants to export, but over the long term, this is a shared interest. The US wants generics as low-cost drugs as possible, and India is in the best position to supply them. So I think there are a number of areas in which this basic principle, the cost efficiency or the best value for money, is going to keep that relationship going. On both sides of the border, business interests, I think, and I'm speaking, of course, there is the whole security and the geostrategic aspect, which I'm sure other panelists will get into. But the fact that business interests, commercial interests are driving the relationship, I think provides a kind of stability and a predictability to it, which is really what is going to drive the long-term process. So thank you for listening to me.